In the training videos for Module 6, we're going to talk about formatting report objects and the report layout for Genero Report Writer 2.21. The objectives for these trainings is at the end of this instruction, you're going to be able to position report objects on a report. You're going to be able to identify object properties that are common to all objects, and you're going to be able to provide, edit, and reset property values. Now, this may look like a very limited list, but there's a lot of properties out there and a lot of settings that you can apply. And we're going to take our time working through those so that you can understand which properties are commonly used and which ones are important to you. For this first slide, we're going to talk about positioning using the X and Y properties. But first, let's go and just take a look at Studio. So here I have a report opened up in Studio. And if I wanted to drag and drop a Word box onto this form, I know that there's two things that I could do. Let me go ahead and put a stripe out here. So I've added a stripe, and a stripe, as we know, is a propagating container. Now, when I go to drag and drop a Word box into this stripe, we also know that if I hold down the Control key, I'm doing relative positioning, and it's going to snap to inside of that container. If I don't hold down the Control key, it's doing absolute positioning or specific layouting, and it's going to drop wherever I place it. You'll notice on the one where I held down the Control key, where I did the dynamic layouting, the X and Y properties are empty. However, if we look at the word box that I placed by using specific layouting, you'll see that both the X and Y property are populated. So what we want to talk about on this slide is how do you position an object inside of its parent object using the X and Y properties. In the first example we give up here, if you want to center it in that parent, you set X and Y both equal to max divided by 2. If you set them equal to just max, it's going to push it all the way over along the y-axis. By doing max divided by 2, it's going to take it halfway across. So let's take a look right here. You'll see here's my parent container. The y-axis is going from left to right, and I can see that here. My layout direction is left to right. And right now, this object, I have my x and y set to specific numeric values. What if I change it to max divided by 2? The first thing you'll see, you can see that red dot moving up halfway for the x. If I then take y and do max divided by 2, you see that the red dot now, the attachment point, is in the center, the exact center of its parent object. Now, I wanted the entire report item to be centered. You'll notice that it only centered the attachment point. That's the next part of this slide when it says I want to then make my anchor point be in the middle of the object itself. So I can go to Genero Studio and I can set my anchor point to be 0.5 and 0.5. Now you can see that my anchor point has moved to the exact center of the object itself. The next one, if we want it to be in the bottom right-hand side of the parent, we're going to set it equal to max max. Let's see, so I go and let's take away the -2. So if I set it to max and max, we expect it to go to the bottom right, and we expect the attachment point to go to the bottom right. Now, similarly, if I want my entire object to be within that parent, I'm going to need to change its anchor point. So it's 1 and 1. And now my anchor point is at the bottom right-hand side of the object. If I had it left it at the default, and you can click on the arrows to go to the default, you'll see that it moves the anchor point back up to its default location, which is the upper left corner, and therefore, based upon the X and Y, it places the attachment point. However, I can see that the object itself is off the page. Let me go ahead and bring it back to the center. And let me set my anchors back to 0.5 and 0.5. And now let's look at the last tip on the slide. So first off, just by manipulating the X and Y, you can enter numbers or you can enter percents. You can get it to move about within the parent container. But the other important thing is then you have to think about where you want your anchor point to be. You do have a contextual menu when you right-click that lets you solidify the position, and it sets the X and Y coordinates. Let me show you this right now on inside of Studio. So if I right-click here, we see it's max divided by 2 and max divided by 2. If I right-click and I say I want to set the horizontal position so that it's always fixed from the left-hand side, it's going to put in the number so that regardless of how I stretch the parent object, it's always going to be positioned at 271.012 within that object. Likewise, if I say, okay, well, let me look at the vertical position, I want it always fixed from the bottom. So it's going to always be 43.6614 up from the bottom. Now, if I grab my parent container, I stretch it down, you can see it's always fixed at that duration because I had right click and I said I want to set it so that it's fixed from the bottom. If you say proportional to height, you're going to get it so that as I change the size, it's always going to be within that same proportion from the height. The other thing to notice is that you have on the direction of the parent's x-axis, you're going to be able to set an alignment node if you want. Let's say I wanted to align it to the top. I could set that. I could align it to the bottom. You'll notice when I'm doing this, it sets the circle equal to yellow because we're now using that mixed, where one is relative and the other is positional. And you'll see by changing the alignment from to center, my alignment attribute also changes. If you're absolute positioning an object, it can be measured in three ways. It can either be measured from the top down, for example, 2 centimeters. It can be measured from the bottom up. For our discussion here, we're assuming a square that's 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters, that the layout is the top to bottom. So if we're going from the top down and we put in the y-axis as 2 centimeters, it's going to drop it down 2 centimeters. If we instead specify for that y property max minus 3, that means it's going to go to the bottom of the object and then go up 3 centimeters. Now, since our object is 5 centimeters high, that's still going to place it in that same position of 2 centimeters down from the top. We could also do it relative to the height. So we could say max times 0.4. We know the max is 5. 5 times 0.4 is going to give us the 2 centimeters. So what method you choose is going to depend on what you want to happen to the object if and when the parent is resized. So naturally, if you specify from the top with straight values such as 2 centimeters, resizing it isn't going to change the fact that we're always going to put it out at 2 centimeters. If you're measuring it from the bottom, by increasing the height, you're lowering the item. If you decrease the height, you in fact raise the item up so that it's less than 2 centimeters down from the top. And if it's relative to height, it's always going to be proportional to the height, however large or small you make that. So again, looking at Gennaro Studio, right here I have a container. This container has an X size and a Y size of 5 centimeters, and I can see the layout direction is top to bottom. What that means is my y-axis for this parent container is going from top to bottom. So when I go to my word box that I've placed in here, if I change the y to be 3 centimeters, you can see it drops down, so it's 3 centimeters from the top. If I wanted to write this instead from a position from the bottom, well, actually, wait first. Since it's 3 centimeters from the top, if I expand it, nothing is happening because it's always 3 centimeters from the top. Now, what instead we did, instead of doing 3 centimeters from the top, if we did a max minus 2 centimeters, as long as our square remains 5 by 5, as long as the parent remains 5 by 5, that doesn't affect it. However, now if I resize it, it's always going to be 3 from the bottom. So by doing max minus 2 centimeters, you're always making it relative to the bottom of the parent object. Let me take it back to 5 centimeters. If I, instead of doing max minus 2, if I do max times 0.6, again, we don't see it move on the 5 by 5. However, if I start changing the height of this, you're going to see that it's always going to be proportionally 6/10 down from the top. Some properties can be inherited from the parent object. So you can define some properties higher up in the hierarchy of the report structures, such as defining things on the page root. and they are used then as the default for the whole report. Now, the easiest two properties to identify when it comes to this is font and font size. If you define the font and font size on the page root, all the objects on the report are going to use this font unless explicitly stated otherwise. So let's take a look at this. If I go into my Gennaro Studio, let me go ahead and open up my list report. Right here on the list report, if I go into my page root, what I expect to see in the font, it's using a default value. Let me select something else, Algerian. You'll see that it ripples down to all the other values. What if I go and I change it for a specific item? Or I want it to be Arial. It'll change it for that specific item. What happens if I change it for something like the table header row itself? You'll see that now all the children of that item are inheriting its setting. When it comes time to drag the report elements or the data objects onto a report, you could in theory just place them all directly on the page root itself. However, if possible, you should be grouping the objects together inside a single parent if those objects are related. Why do you want to do this? You can use inheritance and define the property once in the parent. It inherits by all its children. If you relocate the parent, if you move it around the report, the child's objects are going to move along with that parent. So some examples, if I'm creating a address box, I can have my word boxes vertically aligned inside of this address box. I place them inside of a vertical box layout node. If I want to move the address, I just have to move that vertical box. If I want to change the font for all the items in that address, I just have to change the font for the vertical box. One of the properties that you can set for any report object is a background color. One of the reasons you might want to set the background color is to identify what object is which, or to better view the space that the object used. So the method is to give it a color that's different than the other report objects that are around it. This can be helpful in debugging. You're going to want to remember to remove it before you go live. But let's take a quick look. So if I go and open up my empty 4RP, here I have hello. If I wanted to visually see the space that it's taking up, what I can do is navigate down and I can find the colors. And so for background color, let me click my ellipse and let me select a color for it to use. I can now visually see what space that word box is taking up. If I wanted to then visually see the space being taken up by its horizontal box layout node container, I could again go into there, find its background color, set it to be a different color, and now even though I'm not seeing the lines on the report, I can visually see the space that that horizontal box is taking up. If you want to change a property for multiple objects, it is possible as long as those objects all share that same property. So what you need to do is control select the objects, and then you change the property value once, it will change for all objects that you've selected. Let's go ahead and take a look at this. On my report here, I've placed 3 word boxes. Let me just verify. You can see I have 3 word boxes on this report. If I do control select, I can select all the word boxes. And then any of the properties that they share in common, I'm allowed to change. Now, because they're all word boxes, I know all 3 of them share the same properties. Let me go ahead and choose a different font size. I'll make the font Algerian, and you can see that it's been changed across all objects. For the next couple slides, we're going to talk about how you would arrange a debits and credits columns on a report. Now, typically when you build a report and you're dealing with debits and credits, you'll have 2 columns going down the report. If it's a credit, it will appear on the credit side or the credit column. If it's a debit, it will appear in the debit side or the debit column. So we have our 2 adjacent columns displayed in 4GL. Positive values we want to display in that first column. Set negative values we want to display in that second column. How do we achieve this? Well, we achieve this by putting some expressions into both the format property and the value property. So let's look at the value property first. For the credit column, we're going to say if the value is greater than 0, then I want you to print out the volume, otherwise print out 0. For the column 2, we're saying if the value is less than 0, then I want you to put out, in this case, -1 times the rec value. So I'm going to turn it into a positive number, but I'm going to display it in the debit column so that the user knows it's a negative. And then I'm going to, otherwise I'll put a 0. So I know that one of the columns is going to contain a 0 and the other is going to contain a number. Now, how do I get it so that the credit or debit is blank when it doesn't contain that number? What I do is I use my hash sign when I'm going to do my formatting. So my column 1 formatting, if the value is greater than 0, then I want you to put it out using definitely value.value. So I want to have at a minimum 0.00 or whatever the positive value is. And then if it gets a larger number than takes up one space to the left of the decimal, the hash sign says print as many numbers as you need. However, otherwise, if the value is not greater than 0 in the credit column, I'm going to do the hash, and the hash is saying unless there's a value there, don't print it. So the fact that it's 0 means that this will not print out, so the column will be blank. And we do the reverse on the debit side as well. If the value is less than 0, then I want you to format the number because I know a number is there. Otherwise, you're not going to format it. You're going to leave that space blank. If we take a quick look at this from the viewpoint of Gennaro Studio, so you can see I have a credit and debit column. Inside I have my two fields, and if I look at my two fields, one is my credit field. If I go down and look at its format, I see if the datum item price is greater than 0, then I want you to print this out. Otherwise, format that single character, and if it's a 0, it won't print at all. And when I go and look at my value property, I can see if the value is greater than 0, then populate it with this value, otherwise populate it with 0. And I would just do that. And if we look at the debit side, it's the same thing, it's just we're looking for less than 0. Now you'll notice on my report, both of these have little red X's, and I can run this report. It does run successfully. If I wanted to view what these little red X's mean, I could go and look at the document errors, and it's telling me that I have a type mix match. This doesn't stop the report from running, so this is more an informational message.